Number 1. The weapons nobody expected to find intact. A German lignite quarry near the town of Schöningen turned into an archaeological site almost by accident in the mid-1990s, when excavator Hartmut Thieme noticed shaped wood coming up out of waterlogged clay that should have rotted away tens of thousands of years earlier. What eventually came out of that clay was a set of wooden throwing spears, several of them over 2 meters long, carved with a forward-weighted balance point that mirrors the physics of a modern javelin. The layer they came from has been dated to somewhere around 300,000 years old, long before anatomically modern humans existed. Whoever shaped this wood understood aerodynamics well enough to put the mass exactly where a spear needs it to fly straight, and the horse remains found alongside the spears, including one pelvis with a broken spear tip still lodged in the bone, make clear these weren't ceremonial. They were used, repeatedly, on animals large enough to fight back. What makes this genuinely unsettling isn't the spears themselves, it's the math behind their survival. Wood almost never survives this kind of time span. Stone tools dominate the archaeological record of this era for the simple reason that stone is the only thing left standing after several 100,000 years of decay, and every reconstruction of early hominin capability has been built on that incomplete survivorship. Schöningen is the exception that got lucky, sealed in anoxic clay at the edge of an ancient lakebed where oxygen and the bacteria that need it couldn't reach. If one freak preservation pocket contains sophisticated, engineered weaponry, the honest question is not what Schöningen tells us, it's how much of the same sophistication existed everywhere else and simply rotted before anyone could measure it. Number 2. A fingerprint in fired clay. In 1925, in a layer of hearth ash at a site called Dolní Věstonice in the Moravian Basin, archaeologists found a small broken figurine, reassembled it, and realized they were holding the oldest known fired ceramic object on Earth, dated to roughly 26,000 years before present. It predates the next confirmed tradition of deliberate pottery firing by well over 10,000 years, and it was made by people who had no agriculture, no permanent architecture, and were hunting mammoth in a climate colder than anywhere in modern Europe. Firing clay at controlled temperature is not an accidental discovery. It requires understanding how a kiln behaves, how moisture escapes without cracking the object, and how long to sustain heat before the material becomes permanent. Researchers studying the figurine's surface under magnification in the early 2000s found something that turns the object from an artifact into something closer to a witness statement. A small fingerprint pressed into the unfired clay, ridge detail intact, belonging by its size and spacing to a child, somewhere between roughly 7 and 15 years old. Not the maker's print necessarily, just someone who was there, who reached out and touched something soft that was about to become permanent, 26,000 years before anyone would think to look at it under a microscope. Nearby graves at the same site hold individuals buried with clear evidence of ritual, which means this was never simply a hunting camp. It was a place complex enough to produce ceremony, technical mastery of a difficult material, and, apparently, curious children standing close enough to the kiln to leave a mark that would outlast every civilization that came after them. Number 3. The monument that predates the reason we thought monuments existed. In the mid-1990s, German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt began excavating a hill in southeastern Turkey called Göbekli Tepe, after local farmers mentioned that oddly shaped stones kept surfacing during plowing. What he eventually uncovered was a series of large circular stone enclosures built from T-shaped limestone pillars, some standing over 5 meters tall and weighing several tons, carved with detailed reliefs of foxes, boars, vultures, and abstract humanoid figures. The oldest construction phases date to roughly 11,500 years ago, which places the site firmly before the archaeological appearance of agriculture in the same region. That ordering matters enormously, because the standard model of civilization has always assumed farming came first, produced surplus food, and that surplus eventually freed enough labor to build monuments. Göbekli Tepe has no domesticated grain, no domesticated animals, no permanent housing. It has only the pillars, extensive quarrying evidence, and the bones of wild game eaten on site by people who organized enough collective labor to move and carve multi-ton stone without ever settling down. Then, roughly 2,000 years after construction began, the enclosures were deliberately filled in and buried, not left to collapse, but intentionally packed with rubble and soil. Someone chose to bury the work of dozens of generations, and whatever the reason was, it has not survived in any form we can read. What we're left with is a monument that inverts the entire assumed order of civilization, and a burial that looks less like abandonment and more like a decision that nobody, ever again, should have to look at it. Number 4. 27 people, killed and left where they fell. Near the shore of Lake Turkana in Kenya, at a site called Nataruk, researchers surveying an ancient lagoon margin in 2012 uncovered the scattered remains of at least 27 individuals, men, women, and children, none of them buried, none of them given grave goods, all left exposed in what had once been marshy ground at the water's edge. When the findings were published in 2016, the injury pattern left little room for alternative interpretation. Multiple skulls showed blunt force trauma consistent with more than one size of club, meaning more than one attacker. Several individuals had fractured hands and forearms, the defensive injuries produced when someone raises an arm to block a blow they can't avoid. 2 skeletons had stone projectile points still lodged in the body, and the obsidian used for at least one of them doesn't occur naturally anywhere near the site, meaning whoever carried it in came from somewhere else. The remains date to roughly 10,000 years ago, squarely inside the hunter-gatherer period that mainstream anthropology long treated as too mobile, too resource-poor, and too socially loose to produce organized, premeditated violence between groups. Nataruk is one of the clearest physical counterexamples to that assumption on record, and the detail that makes it impossible to file away as an isolated skirmish is the woman found among the dead, in the late stages of pregnancy, her wrists positioned together in a way consistent with having been bound. Some researchers have pushed back on parts of the interpretation, questioning whether every individual at the site died in the same event. The wounds, the obsidian, and the bound wrists remain regardless, sitting in sediment at the edge of a lake that no longer exists in the shape it did 10,000 years ago. Number 5. The man who was eating when the arrow hit him. In September 1991, 2 hikers in the Ötztal Alps came across what they assumed was a recently deceased climber emerging from melting ice. The body belonged to a man who had died roughly 5,300 years earlier, now known as Ötzi. What he was carrying told archaeologists immediately that he mattered: a copper axe with a blade of nearly pure copper, a longbow, a flint dagger, fire-starting tools, and clothing stitched together from at least 5 different animal hides. Isotope analysis on the copper later traced its ore source to southern Tuscany, hundreds of kilometers from where he died, meaning the metal had already moved a long distance through trade or travel before it reached him. For roughly a decade after his discovery, the working assumption was that Ötzi had simply frozen to death, an unlucky traveler caught by weather at high altitude. Then a routine scan in 2001 found an arrowhead buried beneath his shoulder blade, the shaft snapped off, the wound unhealed, the artery beneath it severed. He had bled out on the mountain, and stomach content analysis later showed he had eaten a substantial meal of meat and grain only a short time before he died. He wasn't running, he wasn't fighting, he was sitting somewhere sheltered, eating, when someone below him on the slope fired an arrow into his back. A defensive wound on his hand suggests he had been in a close struggle with someone at some point before that, days perhaps, that he survived. The mountain is what finally killed him, but a person made the decision that put the arrow there, and 5,300 years later, the melting glaciers that preserved the whole scene are now retreating fast enough that other bodies from this same deep window of time are beginning, slowly, to surface. Number 6. A machine that shouldn't have existed for another 14 centuries. In 1901, sponge divers working a wreck off the Greek island of Antikythera recovered a corroded lump of bronze along with statues and pottery from the ship. It sat largely ignored until a museum director in Athens noticed gear teeth embedded in the corrosion the following year. What it turned out to be, once X-ray and later high-resolution CT scanning were applied across the following century, was a geared mechanical computer, roughly 30 bronze gears, housed in a wooden frame small enough to carry aboard a ship, built sometime around the 2nd or 1st century before the Common Era. It could track the position of the sun and moon, predict solar and lunar eclipses using a variable speed gear train that compensates for the moon's elliptical orbit, model the visible motion of the 5 planets known at the time, and calculate the timing of the Pan-Hellenic Games. The precision of its gear cutting, in some places accurate to fractions of a millimeter, has no known parallel in the surviving historical record for roughly 1,400 years afterward. Not a simplified version, not a partial successor, nothing. Whatever tradition of mechanical engineering produced this object vanished so completely that when the gears were first noticed in 1902, nobody could immediately explain what they were looking at. The object survives only because a ship carrying it happened to sink near a small island, which raises an uncomfortable question about how many equivalent devices and equivalent traditions of knowledge went down with ships that were never found at all. Number 7. 20,000 people who decided the surface wasn't safe anymore. In 1963, a resident of the Turkish town of Derinkuyu knocked through a wall in his basement and found a tunnel behind it. That tunnel led to another, and eventually to an underground city descending roughly 85 meters through at least 18 excavated levels, complete with stables, wine and oil presses, food storage, a chapel, ventilation shafts by the thousand reaching to the surface, and heavy circular stone doors that could be rolled shut from the inside to seal off entire sections against anyone trying to get in from above. At capacity, the complex could reportedly shelter around 20,000 people along with livestock and stored provisions for extended periods underground. This wasn't a bolt hole dug in a panic. The scale of planning, the permanence of the storage areas, and the presence of a decorated chapel point to a community that expected to live down there, not just hide there. Parts of the complex saw documented use by Byzantine-era Christian communities sheltering from raids centuries later, but the earliest excavation layers are older, and their original builders and original motive remain genuinely unresolved. Whatever was happening on the surface at the time construction began, it was serious enough that an entire community decided a carved rock labyrinth deep underground was the safer option, and serious enough that they kept building, level after level, for long enough to need 18 of them. Number 8. A shape on the seafloor that nobody can agree on. In 1986, a diver scouting the waters off Yonaguni Island in southern Japan came across a massive underwater rock formation with flat terraces, sharp right-angle edges, and a stepped profile that looked, to him, unmistakably built rather than eroded. The structure sits at a depth that would have been dry land during the last glacial maximum, when sea levels were more than 100 meters lower than they are today, meaning whatever is down there has been underwater for at minimum 8 to 10,000 years. One camp of researchers, led for decades by a University of the Ryukyu's marine geologist, argues the terracing, the apparent tool marks, and the geometry are evidence of intentional construction. A separate camp, including a Boston University geologist known for reassessing the age of the Sphinx, argues the local sandstone naturally fractures along these same rectangular planes under seismic stress, and that the region's high earthquake activity is more than sufficient explanation without invoking a lost civilization at all. Neither side has produced evidence decisive enough to end the argument. What's certain is that if any part of the intentional construction interpretation holds up, it would mean organized stoneworking activity in a region and era, with no other confirmed record of it, submerged under the same post-glacial sea level rise that has quietly erased coastal evidence of human activity across huge stretches of the planet, most of which has never been surveyed at all. Number 9. A carving that may describe the sky falling. Deep inside Göbekli Tepe sits a single pillar, catalogued as Pillar 43, more densely carved than almost anything else at the site, showing a vulture with an outstretched wing positioned over what looks like a disc or sphere, a headless human figure beneath it, and a row of scorpion-like symbols along the base. In 2017, researchers proposed that the imagery functions as a record of a specific historical sky, correlating the carved symbols to constellation positions as they would have appeared roughly 12,800 years ago, and connecting the sphere above the vulture to a possible comet or cosmic impact event. That timeframe lines up with the proposed trigger for the Younger Dryas, an abrupt and severe cooling period supported by a layer of unusual material, including nanodiamonds and elevated platinum, found across more than 100 sites on multiple continents, all dated to the same narrow window and coinciding with the disappearance of the Clovis toolmaking tradition in North America and the extinction of dozens of large mammal species. The impact interpretation, for both the geological evidence and the carving itself, remains genuinely contested, with multiple research teams unable to replicate the anomalous material findings at other sites, and archaeoastronomers questioning whether reading a 12,000-year-old carving as a literal star chart is scientifically supportable at all. What isn't contested is the timing. Göbekli Tepe's construction begins in almost exactly the window this hypothesis points to, built by mobile hunter-gatherer groups who, under the standard model, shouldn't have had the social coordination to quarry and erect multi-ton pillars at all, unless something had just happened to their world serious enough to demand a monument. Number 10. the eruption that may have nearly erased everyone reading this. Roughly 74,000 years ago, the Toba caldera on the island of Sumatra produced the largest volcanic eruption of at least the past 2.5 million years, releasing an estimated 2,800 cubic kilometers of material, thousands of times the volume ejected by Mount St. Helens in 1980. Ash from the eruption has been recovered from sediment cores across the Indian Ocean and in archaeological layers as far away as East Africa and southern India, in places settling several meters deep, evidence not of a regional disaster, but a planetary one. Climate modeling based on the eruption's estimated sulfur output suggests global temperatures may have dropped several degrees Celsius for years afterward, a volcanic winter stacked on top of an already cold glacial period. Around the same broad window, geneticists studying modern human diversity identified a population bottleneck, a period when the entire human species appears to have been reduced to a surprisingly small number of breeding individuals, small enough that some estimates put the figure in the low thousands. Anthropologist Stanley Ambrose proposed in 1998 that Toba caused this bottleneck directly, and while the theory has since been significantly contested, with archaeological sites in southern India showing continuous tool-making traditions immediately above and below the ash layer, and more recent genetic work placing the bottleneck closer to 50,000 years ago, the underlying fact remains undisturbed either way. At some point in the deep past, the entire human species narrowed down to a population small enough to fit inside a stadium, survived on nothing more than luck and geography, and every person alive today, every language, every argument, every idea anyone has ever had, descends from whoever happened to be standing in the right place when it mattered. The volcano is still there. Lake Toba now fills the caldera, the underlying system is still classified as active, and nothing about the geology says this kind of event can't happen again. It simply hasn't, yet, on a species that now numbers in the billions, and has never once had to find out what that would mean.